My name is Christine and I'm a science policy advisor at the FWO. I will be very happy to answer your questions at the end of this webinar because we will also have a live Q&A session afterwards. If any questions already pop up during the presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat box and then we will get to them at the end of the session. But first, to start, I will go over the main modalities of the program for senior clinical investigators. So to translate basic scientific knowledge into applications that directly benefit patients or general healthcare, you as clinician scientists are ideally placed. From your clinical experience, you know what the system needs and what the patient needs. And because of your scientific training, you are in an ideal position to advance practice-oriented research. And indeed, a study by Ankaars and colleagues has shown that clinical scientists are more likely to perform use-inspired research that builds on prior insights from applied literature. And moreover, their studies are also more likely to trigger applied follow-up research. Unfortunately, however, although clinician scientists could be an important motor driving forward translational biomedical research, in practice, often they are not free to engage in such endeavors because they are fully occupied in the clinic. And this is then where the FWO endeavors to provide a solution by freeing funds to release clinician scientists from their clinical duties and giving them time to perform such translational research. And that same study by Ankaars and colleagues has also demonstrated that our FWO fellows have an increased publication rate compared to their peers, and importantly also that their research focus shifts more towards a translational perspective, which then can have important consequences for patients and also for the healthcare system in general. An important remark to be made here is that this senior clinical investigator fellowship is part-time only, meaning that the fellow will still remain strongly embedded in the clinic at the same time. So the fellowship is actually quite unique in this respect. It will not be paid out to the fellows themselves, but rather the hospital will use it to finance their clinical replacement. And usually the grant is meant for a 50% replacement. However, there are also exceptional cases where a fellow cannot be spared from the clinic for the full 50%. And in that case, we do have an alternative option in place where the fellow will be replaced for 20%, and then the remaining funds can be used to finance the scientific or technical supporting staff. Typically, this would be, for instance, a PhD student or a lab technician, but other options are also possible. This 20% option should be the exception rather than the rule, because we actually prefer the fellows to work for 50% on their research. And in this case, such an exception is warranted. It should be thoroughly motivated in the application. A typical example would be, for instance, a surgeon who performs very complicated procedures and who cannot really be replaced in the clinic so easily. And in that case, this should also be attested in writing by the head of the clinic. So that brings me to the main goal of this fellowship program at the FWO. And this is also the main motivation that will be relayed to the evaluators. So we wish to select the most promising candidates who have a good track record, a solid project idea, and a convincing vision on how to establish themselves as independent clinician researchers. So now for the practicalities. In order to be eligible to apply, you should be recognized to practice your profession in Belgium as a medical specialist or a GP, or alternatively as a pharmacist specialized in clinical biology. You should be working at a university hospital affiliated to a Flemish university with a contract of indefinite duration. And for GPs, you should be affiliated to a Flemish University Department of Family Medicine for the duration of the fellowship. You should spend at least 80% of a full-time equivalent on purely clinical activities, meaning that you're not already working as a researcher, for instance. You should hold a PhD degree with no more than 20 years of seniority. And similar to all other FWO fellowships, we allow you only 2 attempts to apply for this fellowship. However, the program has been revised a few years ago, and since then the counter has been reset and you can apply twice again, regardless of previous attempts. So the overall aim of the fellowship is to provide a platform to our fellows to establish themselves as independent researchers. The fellowship has a duration of 5 years and it is renewable twice, meaning that in the best case, the fellow will have funding for a consecutive period of 15 years, which we hope should give them ample time to build their own research line with long-term perspectives. The budget is 60,000 euros per year available to finance the clinical replacement. And for general practitioners, the calculation of the annual fee will be based on the wages of a part-time lecturer at the university, taking into account seniority. In case the fellow chose this exceptional 20% replacement option, the remainder of the budget can be used to finance supporting staff, but also here the maximum amount per year will be 60,000 euros. In addition, our first-time fellows will also receive a bench fee to help them start up their research. And this bench fee will amount to a total of 100,000 euros for the total period, or 20,000 euros per year. And here the same rules and regulations apply as for our other pre- and postdoctoral fellows. There are stringent quality requirements attached to the renewal process. Together with the application for renewal, the fellows will also submit a progress report of their past activities during the previous term, and this will be evaluated by the jury following the criteria that we will discuss in a minute. Importantly, in line with the FWO regulations for other fellowships, there can be no second attempt if the renewal is rejected. And here you also see a graphical representation of the success rate. So each year we have funds to grant 8 new fellowships, which based on the number of applications in the last round translated to a success rate of 53%. So I hope you can appreciate that in comparison to other programs at FWO, the success rate for the clinical fellowships is quite high. Then out of those 8 successful first fellowships, we will renew 6. And out of those 6, 4 can be renewed for a third and final period. So what do you need to apply for this fellowship? First of all, you need the formal commitment of both the director of the hospital and the dean of the Faculty of Medicine. So the hospital director should attest that they will provide actual clinical replacement for you. And here it is also highly recommended to have the name of the person or the people who will be replacing you already written down in the application. Second, they should also guarantee that you will be reinstated in your original position upon completion of the fellowship. And then the dean of the faculty should attest that you will be affiliated to the university to perform research for the duration of the fellowship. You should submit your application via the e-portal on the FWO website. And because our jury consists of international experts, please make sure that your entire application, including also all of the support letters and attachments, are written in English so that the evaluators can understand it. The jury will evaluate several aspects of the application on the level of the candidate, as well as the proposed research program. And for a final renewal, also the future planning after completion of the fellowship will be taken into account. So looking at the evaluation criteria in more detail, first of all, concerning the level of the candidates, for a first-time application, both the scientific experience as well as the clinical expertise are taken into consideration. Also, whether the candidate has already established connections to basic research groups that can ensure the feasibility of the planned program. Past and planned mobility will also be taken into account. And importantly, because we really want to protect the time that our fellows can actually spend on their research, we ask you to provide a very clear plan regarding the substitution of the clinical tasks, which should, as mentioned, also be supported by the hospital management. For a renewal of the fellowship, the jury will evaluate the progress report of the previous term with a special focus on the scientific growth and the international reputation. Also, the translational nature of the research and the impact on clinical practice will be taken into account here. And then also in this case, the substitution plan will again be evaluated. Then concerning the proposed research program, the jury will assess the innovative nature of the research, the quality of the proposed approach, its feasibility, and as mentioned before, the clinical impact, meaning that this should be a translational research study. And then, as said already, for the final renewal, we would also like to see that the established research lines have long-term perspective, meaning that the hospital has plans to continue this also after completion of the fellowship, and preferably, of course, that the fellow will still remain in the driving seat to continue this. Successful candidates will work under the regulations for senior clinical investigator, which you can find on our website. Once you're active as a fellow, if you have not done so already, we expect a signed declaration from you specifying the details of your replacement. You will provide 2 reports of your scientific activities, one midterm and one at the end of the term, which will then be used to evaluate your renewal if applicable. And all those reports will be assessed by the jury clinical fellowships. As most of you will be performing clinical research, I would like to point out that we also expect our fellows to adhere to the European regulation on the registration and reporting of clinical trials. We fully advocate the benefits of transparency of clinical studies, and we therefore expect you not only to register your trial, but also to inform the FWO upon inclusion of the first patient, and obviously to report your results appropriately. Your compliance with these regulations can also be taken into account during the evaluation of your reports, and as such, it can also have consequences for your future applications at the FWO. So here are a few additional tips and tricks on how to submit a winning application. As said already, the emphasis of the call is on translational research because we believe this is where clinician scientists can make the difference. So please make sure that your topic of choice is both innovative and translational. Following the international trends to advance research assessment, the FWO is moving away from a one-sided quantitative bibliometric assessment of your scientific performance towards a more broad view of a candidate's achievements. So therefore, we have widened our application form, allowing you also to enter a more narrative view on your main achievements in a broad sense. And our evaluators, on the other hand, will also receive specific instructions on how to take into account this wider view in the evaluation. The purpose of the fellowship is that the clinician researcher can build a research portfolio that has strong future perspectives. And therefore, it is also important that the hospital will engage itself to continue what the fellow started. So please make sure that this commitment is attested in the proposal. In order for your application to have a higher chance of making the cut, we highly recommend that you check the score grids that the jury members will use to evaluate your proposal. These grids contain all of the evaluation criteria, and they can be found on the Senior Clinical Investigator page on the FWO website. I would suggest that you try to assess your application using this score grid, and if possible, that you also ask one of your peers to do the same to make sure that you check all the boxes. It is important that you start preparing your application well in advance. Please make sure that you obtain all of the required attestations, for instance, the certificate that you're recognized to practice in Belgium and all the required signatures from the hospital management and the dean. The content of these letters should be relevant and specific because it will be looked at by the evaluators. For instance, ask your clinical supervisor to describe your clinical activities and the concrete plan for the substitution. In case you opt for the exceptional 20% substitution, also make sure to properly motivate this choice. If possible, provide all of the details of your clinical replacement already in full, because this will give you bonus points, as you will see in the score grid. And finally, also make sure that you've updated and prepared your Personalia page on the FWO platform. So as you will notice on the e-portal, the proposal has a lot of fields to complete, so not only the project description, but also a lot of other fields containing important information. And I also would like to point out that since this round, the FWO will look more strictly at all of the regulations on the formal requirements that your application should adhere to. So please make sure that you fill all of the necessary boxes to make sure that you don't have any problems with eligibility of your application. So now I will briefly go over all of the fields that have to be filled out, just to give you an idea already of the information and documentation you should prepare. So first of all, in the general field, we will ask you, of course, for title and abstract of your application to indicate which scientific disciplines are most related to your research, and also to briefly outline the science communication strategy that you will use to communicate your findings to a non-expert audience. Then secondly, we will ask all of the details of where you're going to perform your research. So you have to fill out the host institution and details on where you're currently clinically appointed. As said already, this should be at least for an 80% full-time equivalent. We also ask you to provide all of the details on the clinical substitution and the motivation in case you require the exception of 20% substitution. As said already, you should also include letters and an official attestation by the government. Then for the extra data, we ask you to write about your previous research activities, what was the title of your PhD thesis, which should be achieved no later than June of the year where you're applying for the fellowship. You can also note down your plans for mobility and whether you already had mobility in the past, and list whether you obtained any awards. Then the next tab will be very important for the evaluation, of course, of your CV. So here we ask you to relate both your scientific and your clinical track record, and also specifically to relate how those two parts are actually joined together and what the relationship is between your clinical experience and your proposed research. Here you can also list your 5 main achievements, and as I already indicated before, we like to look broadly, so these don't have to be publications only, but can be achievements in a more broad sense. And you can also list any other relevant scientific output and impact you might have already achieved. There is also the option here to describe any career breaks you might have had up till now. And then we get to the tab on the project proposal itself. So here you can upload the description of your project. There is a Word template available on the website, and we ask you to write no more than 10 pages, including all illustrations and references. And please, again, strictly adhere to the formal requirements to make sure that your application will remain eligible. We also ask you to note down whether you have applied for or already received any parallel funding, and to note down some details about the societal actors that are involved in your research and how you considered the issues of gender, sex, and diversity in the research. On the section on research context, we ask you to explain how your project fits within the broader research context where you're active, and how you are already collaborating with basic research groups that will help you to build a bridge between basic research and clinical practice. And here you can also describe with which international research groups you are collaborating. Then there is also a questionnaire on ethics that we ask you to complete. I think it's important to mention here that at this point, when you're applying, the FWO does not require you to already have received ethical approval for the proposed research activities, with the exception in case you would be working with non-human primates. So it's only after the application has been granted and before actually starting any ethically sensitive activities that we require you to obtain ethical approval. For this, of course, you should contact the relevant ethical committee, but also additional regulations might apply at your own host institution. to whom you can always reach out for further details. And the same holds true for the data management plan. So the application will also include a questionnaire on data management. So please fill out here what data types you will be using and what your plans are for storing the data and potentially also sharing it among the broader research community for at least 5 years after completion of the fellowship. It is not necessary at the point of application to already formally write a DMP, but this will be required within 6 months after starting the project. It's at that point, it has to be submitted to the host institution, and it is actually only at the very end of your term that you have to submit a final DMP to the FWO as an attachment of your final scientific report. And with that, I would like to conclude with the important dates for this year's call. So the call is open since last week, and we expect your application no later than the 2nd of March next year. The results will be announced by the end of May, and the new fellowships will then start in the end of October. The FWO also strives to provide all applicants, regardless of the outcome, with a feedback report, and this will be submitted to all of you in the summer. For more information, I would also like to refer you to our web page where you can find more details on all of the requirements. And of course, you're always free to contact us via email using the email address met@fwo.be.